Back here, don't y'all love your pastor and his wife? Aren't they just special? Pastor Billy, where'd you go? Man, I love y'all. And Christy. Now, did Christy tell you about she and my wife firing automatic weapons in Dallas? Did you tell him that? You got to tell him that. We went out to Dallas for Patriot Mobile, right? And went out to the National Association of Christian Lawmakers and got to travel with Pastor Billy. And my wife Dana and Christy hit it off. And these are real people. They're the real deal, and everything rises and falls on leadership, and they're awesome leaders. Y'all need to appreciate them. I appreciate you letting us host here. And man, it's just, I was at the Hampton Inn checking in, and the lady said, "Where y'all going?" I said, "Canaan Baptist." And she said, "We love those folks. Apparently, y'all fed a bunch of people who had to come here after some hurricane, and that's leadership. That's community involvement. That's leadership. That's what we're talking about." And Pastor Mike, love you, brother. Thank you for coming. You're so special, and appreciate you being here. And it is the honor of a lifetime to be able to travel with David and Cheryl Barton. And I've only been reading his books and coming around, listening to them. I've got every book he's written, I think, and listened to every CD and watched every DVD. And boy, if anybody in the world better describes how special and unique our nation is, I've never heard them. And I read a lot. I love our nation. I believe this country is unique. It was placed here by God with a special purpose, and we enjoy this thing called freedom because of God's hand alone. It was last December that we were here, and I love what Pastor Billy said. I'm going to stop being a 2/3 pastor. I'm going to be a 3/3 pastor from now on. And I can't tell you what an impact that made for me, brother. And that was my dream. I've been doing this for the better part of, 15 or 20 years, just trying to get Christians involved in the process. If we had Christians involved at every level in America, we wouldn't be putting up with this nonsense we're putting up with today. They found how quickly they could take over and actually lead with Christian influence at a local party level, and that needs to happen all over the nation. And so last fall, between July and the middle of the pandemic till December, our little team did 89 in-person meetings. You saw a lot of them. That was the burned out shell of buildings in Kenosha, Wisconsin. That was also the Target in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the peaceful protest took over. And we couldn't even take all the video of the place because of the filthy language that was printed on the side of buildings up there. But in those 89 in-person meetings that we went in 15 states, we met with 2,965 pastors. And I believe with all my heart, if we just inspire pastors, inspire deacons and Sunday school teachers and leaders to know the truth. What's the scripture say? I've been on this Isaiah 59. And judgment is turned away backward. Isaiah 59:14, by the way. And justice standeth afar off, for truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. Boy, indeed, truth has fallen in the street, hasn't it? Now, we're not into the same kind of stuff. David may even tell you, he's been actively involved in getting Americans, especially Christians, missionaries, and Afghanistan folks who've been helpful to the American cause out of that nation. He's been doing that for the last few days, just desperately trying to get people to freedom. I don't know what it's like to toss your baby over a barbed wire fence so they can enjoy freedom. Do you? I don't know what it's like to cling onto an airplane that's taken off because you'd rather fall 1,000 feet to your death than face oppression and slavery and tyranny. I don't know what it's like. But I do know what it's like when unelected bureaucrats shut down churches but kept open marijuana dispensaries. I do want to know what it's like when churches are singled out because we're worshiping and singing. I can't tell you how many cities I've been in that they allowed the marijuana dispensaries or the alcohol places or the bars or casinos, but you can't sing the Christian songs in the park because that was dangerous. I know what that's like. I've watched that. And I believe if we get Christians informed with the truth, because it has fallen in the street, we'll take our nation back for God. I believe this man is the greatest American historian probably that's ever lived. He has more original source documents in his museum that we got to see in Dallas last month than any place other than the Smithsonian, I believe. It was incredible. You are in for a treat. This is the first night. We're going to end up doing some 40 different cities in 16 different states in the next 10 weeks. And I can't thank David and Cheryl enough for taking their time, because just like I told some friends when they said, "When are you going to top what you did last fall?" I said, I believe this is the year that we tell people in the churches that God's role in our nation is irreplaceable. And you will not have American freedom unless you tell people the truth and they go and stand and fight for it. So tonight, you got that chance to learn about the truth. We've even got a QR code on a little piece of paper. You'll see it on there. If you want to get involved locally, nationally, for anything, you just hit that QR code, because tonight what we're going to do is we're going to throw stuff at you. It's going to be like drinking out of a fire hydrant. David's got some books back there, the Founder's Bible. He's got the American Story. I'm reading it my second time right now. You're getting information on how you can take a stand for this place called America. Y'all, please give a great Canaan Baptist welcome to my friend, America's greatest Christian historian, David Barton.
Thanks, guys. Really good to be with you. There's a lot going on, so let me jump into the perspective of what I want to share tonight. I'm going to talk about history for a good bit. History has a real impact on how we see the country right now, how we react to it, what we think about it. There's a great quote by George Orwell, and he says, "He who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past." Let me take the two thoughts and break them out for a minute. Take the first one. Whoever controls the present controls the past. The school boards we've got right now are controlling the way we view our own past. That's why you're seeing this cycle, thousands of parents rise up and run for school board because they don't like the way our past is being portrayed, because what our past is being portrayed will lead to what our future is going to be, and they don't like what that's looking like. So whoever controls the present right now controls the past, but who controls the past controls the future. So right now we're controlling the past, and the way you present your past is what your future is going to be, quite literally. And that's why in the Bible we're told time after time, remember the former days, recall the former times, teach your children the things I've done. It was always about making sure you remember what I've done in the past, because that's going to affect who you are in the future. When Israel forgot who they were, then they were a different nation than when they remembered. And so that's why history is so significant. Now, we have a lot of ways of teaching history in the United States right now. And when you look at some of the ways we teach history and what we do with it, you can take what began in the 1980s. It actually began before then, but popularly in the 1980s, Howard Zinn came out with a book that did a great job of destroying America. Now, America, understand, America's got a lot of blemishes. You know why? Because it's got a lot of people. Anytime you got people, you're going to have blemishes. There's nobody perfect. That's why all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We're told in the book of Romans. That's why we all need a Savior, because we've all screwed up a bunch of stuff. America is part of that. But if you take the story of America and only show all the bad things that happen and never show the good, it changes the way you think about your country. If you were to read the story of David in the Bible, go through 1 Samuel, and all you did was look at David and Bathsheba and Uriah, and that's the only thing you taught about David, you would hate David. He would be such a lousy guy, but that's not the full story of David. He did so much other good stuff, so many things that God made a covenant with him, called the Davidic covenant. It's great stuff. That's the same with America. America's got a lot of blemishes, and what you do is you do what the Bible does. You tell the story of the good and the bad and the ugly, but today we're telling the bad and the ugly, not the good. And he started that back in the 1980s. He started telling every bad thing he could find out about America and not say anything good. That is what has dominated education for the last several decades. If you go, and it's, by the way, called destruction, it's tearing down things. If you go to what we have with the College Board is what does the SAT test, but the College Board also does the AP test. So if you know what AP is, if you're in high school, whatever AP course you go through, and I think the College Board has 47 different AP tests that they have, you get both college and high school credit while you're still in high school. So you're sharp in that subject, and now you get college and high school credit. They're the ones that control the test. And the problem with education now is you teach to the test. Everything's about testing. So it doesn't matter how good your standards are, it doesn't matter how good your textbooks are, it matters what's on your test, because if you can't pass the test, then a lot of things happen. You don't get merit pay, the school doesn't advance, you don't get the right funding. So everything's about passing the test, and right now the AP controls the test. And so if you look at what they do, for example, if you go to the American History Standards, this is not a short little thing. There's 162 pages of standards. This is what teachers use to teach the American history courses for AP courses. There's 460,000 students a year in America that go through this high-level history course in high school. And if you go all the way through the standards now, you'll come out thinking America is the worst nation in the history of the world. As a matter of fact, when you go through World War II, It doesn't talk about Hitler, doesn't talk about the Nazis, doesn't talk about the Holocaust, doesn't talk about the Japanese, doesn't talk about the 3,400 suicide bombs they trained their kids to deliver, doesn't talk about the 20 million that were killed, including the 10 million that were killed in the Japanese, Chinese Holocaust, doesn't include the 6 million that were killed by the Germans and the genocide of the Jews, doesn't have any of that, but it says America dropped an atomic bomb raising questions about American values. We didn't raise questions about Germany's values with 40 million killed in Europe. We didn't raise questions about Japan's values with 20 million killed in the Pacific. We raised questions about America's value because we killed 300,000 to stop the killing, to end the war, and we're the bad guys? Yeah, in today's history standards we are. So, and I don't say this lightly because I've been appointed by a number of states, by state boards of education, to write history and government standards in the states. So we review the textbook, we see the standards. This is very common stuff. And the hate America rhetoric is out there, and it's out there in a very big way. As a matter of fact, you see the rise now of political movements we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. You see what's happened with Marxism, you see what's happened with socialism, you see what's happened with communism. They're all openly accepted today. It's okay that we do this stuff. And out of that is where we get a lot of the critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is nothing new. Critical theory has been taught for a long time. We've now added race to it in the last several decades. And so what we're doing is saying, here's what America's always been. It's always been racially flawed. America's never had any good in it. It's been the worst nation in the world when it comes to race. And so we're portraying this, and a lot of groups have jumped on board with this. And the interesting thing about critical race theory is where it's leading. For example, if you look at critical race theory, and you see it with all these groups, the rioting, rebellion, radicalization, there's nothing moderate about it. You don't sit down and have a discussion over it. You sit down and have violence over it. This is not, let's, as the Bible said, come let us reason together. We're not looking for truth. We're looking for revolution, and we're looking for violence, and we're looking to create some things. And so when you look at critical race theory, interestingly, here's a really good description. I really like the way that all of this movement has been characterized. It takes the position that starting point is that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. Now, if you teach that, that's what you'll believe if you don't know the rest of the story. And I can point out, for example, that America had the first region in the world to fully abolish slavery. By 1804, every northern state had abolished slavery. No nation in the world did it before America. I can point out that no nation signed a law to ban the slave trade before America did in March of 1807. I can point out that after we banned the slave trade, we sent an American squadron to Africa of naval ships to sit off the coast of Africa and not let other nations go to Africa to take slaves out. Now, Africa is a big nation. One squadron couldn't stop it all, but we stopped hundreds of ships. I will point out that America was the fourth nation in the world to ban slavery. Out of hundreds of nations, we're number 4 in the world. I can point out that we had blacks elected to office in America starting in 1641, Matthias de Souza, followed by a number of blacks elected to office, literally hundreds I can take you through in the 16th, 17th, or 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Don't know anything about those guys. I can show you that in the American Revolution, it was not a white man's revolution. As a matter of fact, the average black soldier served 9 times longer than the average white soldier, and it was a purely volunteer army. You had to volunteer to serve 6-month enlistments. The average white guy served 1 enlistment. The average black guy served 9 enlistments. And I can take you through not just the thousands of black soldiers in the Revolution, but the hundreds of black heroes. I have entire books from the early 1800s listing all the heroes and all the commendations and awards that white officers gave black soldiers, and all these black special forces units that were black soldiers. Just unbelievable stuff we don't hear anymore in history today. We don't know that. So what we're told is, oh, and by the way, if you want to gripe about slavery and race, let's talk about what's going on right now. 193 nations in the world today. Out of the 193 nations, 94 still have not abolished slavery. Slavery is still legal in 94 nations today, and you want to gripe about America? Why don't we gripe about the 94 nations that still have slavery? And while we're at it, right now there are 40 million slaves active in the world right now. 40 million. 9.2 million in Africa, 3 million we know of in China. There's a whole lot more than that. 40 million. When you look at the entire history of the African slave trade from 1501 through 1875, there were 12.7 million slaves. We've got 3 times more slaves today, this year, than we've had in the 400-year history of the African slave trade. How come we're not talking? If we really care about race and slavery, let's talk about what's going on right now. One of the organizations I help run is called the Nazarene Fund. Started 6 years ago by a guy named Glenn Beck, national commentator. And that's why we're active in Afghanistan. We found 7,000 Christians Taliban was trying to kill. We wanted to get them out of there before the Taliban killed them. As it turned out, the JSOC, the military guys, asked our operation to take over the airport in Kabul after it was getting so crazy by the State Department. So the last 2 weeks, we ran the airport, getting all the planes out. We've got thousands out trying to save lives, and it got so many being killed that we said, look, we want to save Christians, but you know what? We're going to save Americans. We're going to save SIVs. We're going to save P1s, P2s. You need to be saved. We'll get you out of here. So the 6 planes you may have heard about this week in Newsweek that are sitting on the ground right now, the Taliban are holding, those are our planes. So those are things we're trying to get out. See, slavery is very real in the world today. We got involved in the Middle East 6 years ago because of the slavery of Christians that was going on. All the sex slavery that's happening all over with ISIS and Taliban. We would go in and rescue Christians away from those. 2 of our guys got killed rescuing slaves out of the hands of the Taliban and ISIS. One guy got shot 17 times. He keeps going back to rescue slaves because he thinks it's that important. See, slavery is active today. Why are we griping about what happened 300 years ago? Yes, it happened, and we should teach it. But we should teach the good as well as the bad and the ugly, and that's what we're not teaching today is the good. So we take the start, the critical race theory takes a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery, and that the American constitutional system is the source of our society's ills, and the chief of those ills is racism. So the premise is racism is the biggest problem we face today, and racism is a result of our constitutional system. If we can get rid of the constitutional system, we can get rid of racism. Now that's where this is headed. And that's why the emphasis is on tearing down the system, tearing down the structure. So there's so much here that we don't understand even about our own Constitution. Let me just kind of put some balance here. We like to talk about the bad and the ugly, not the good. So I mentioned there's 193 nations in the world today. Out of those 193 nations, America has had our Constitution since 1789. Now, in the same period of time, we've had one Constitution. Notice what happens for the rest of the world. Notice how often other nations, whether they're allies, friends, foes, doesn't matter, look how many constitutions they've gone through in the same period of time that we've gone through one. Imagine living in some other nation than America. Now, we're told this has got to be the worst nation in the history of the world, but imagine living somewhere else and going through what they go through. Do you know what the average length of a constitution in the history of the world has been? Over the 5,800 years recorded history, the average length of a constitution is 17 years. That's how long a constitution lasts. How long is our Constitution? Well, it's not 17 years. This year we celebrate 234 years. We're so used to stability, we take it for granted. We don't understand that on average, every generation in every other country, on average, you experience a violent revolution every generation and a new Constitution every 17 years. We don't. And we think that we're in bad shape. Oh my gosh, this is why everybody's trying to get into America, not out of America, is they understand how good it is here. And yes, we've got blemishes and faults. Again, the good, the bad, the ugly. But then you look even past that to creativity. America represents 4% of the world's population. 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever, not with us. Our creativity measured by copyrights, patent protection, et cetera, America has produced more inventions, more cures, more medical discoveries than the other 96% of the world. Our lifestyle is so much different than the rest of the world, and we don't even understand that. In the same way, our prosperity, our 4% of the world's population produces 24% of the world's gross domestic product. We are a wealthy, prosperous nation. According to Census Bureau figures, if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe. Living in poverty in America is higher than the middle class in Europe. Yes, that's how much we have been blessed. So this is a term that we now call it American exceptional, and that was a title given to us in 1831 by Lexington Tocqueville, who came here. And you look at how special America is, and the logical question to ask would be, well, who's responsible for all this? Because we are different from other nations. And invariably, what we do today is we say, well, it's our political leaders. And we would look back then and say, well, great political leaders included people like George Washington and people like John Hancock, and you got people like John Adams, great political leaders, and that's fair to look at them. I mean, they did have a big contribution. What I find interesting is in 1816, a young man named Hezekiah Niles went to John Adams. Hezekiah Niles was kind of like, if you will, a millennial of that generation. He was a younger generation than Adams. He said, I'm writing a history book about the United States. I wasn't there for the American Revolution. You were. You were a key figure in it. So I want to ask you, from your viewpoint, who do you think are those that are most responsible for what we enjoy in America? And so as a young man, he's writing, we have the book that he wrote, came out in 1824, The Principles and Acts of the American Revolution by Hezekiah Niles. So he asked John Adams, who would you say is responsible for what we enjoy today? And John Adams started listing names. He said, well, he said, you do have folks like the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, and you've got the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and of course, don't forget the Reverend George Whitfield. Oh, and by the way, there's Reverend Charles Chauncey. He goes through and starts listing preachers. Now today, we might know who Whitfield is, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper, Mayhew, or Chauncey, slim to none. We don't cover that history, and yet the guys who were actually there said it was the church leaders, it was the Christian leaders who made such an impact. See, we don't study these guys today. We don't study folks, whether they're black or white, whether it be Richard Allen or Absalom Jones, or whether it's John Morant or Lemuel Haynes, whether it's Harry Hoosier. And by the way, black and white, I told you earlier, so the American Revolution was not a white revolution. It was white and black and Hispanic and men and women. As a matter of fact, George Washington had 76 generals. 28 of the 76 generals came from foreign nations who came here to help fight. I mean, America was a melting pot back then. We just don't hear that anymore. But let me take somebody like Harry Hoosier. Harry Hoosier, interesting figure. Harry Hoosier was part of the Great Awakening. Now, another figure from the Great Awakening, in addition to George Whitfield, is Francis Asbury. And Francis Asbury said, Harry Hoosier draws larger crowds than I do. Well, Asbury drew huge crowds, just like Whitfield did. And so Harry Hoosier, black evangelist, draws bigger crowds. Benjamin Rush, who's a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he says, I've heard Harry preach. He said, he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, you've heard Patrick Henry and all the guys, and you think Harry's better than everybody you've heard? Yes. See, this is how noted the guy was, how significant he was. We don't study him much today, but it's interesting that Harry really had a ministry for what we would call blue-collar kind of folks. Now, it's not going to be the lawyers, and it's not going to be the attorneys, and it's not going to be the political guys. It's the workers. It was the blue-collar guys. And in his revivals, and so many of them would come to Christ, and their lives would be changed, they'd be transformed. And as blue-collar working class, so many of them were trappers and hunters and mountain men and frontier guys, and that's a pretty rough lifestyle, and their lifestyle reflected that until they came to Christ, and it was a real different lifestyle. But as America started spreading west in the early 1800s, a lot of these guys, being frontiersmen, they moved with America, and they started going west too. And so even though Harry preached along the east coast of America, a lot of these guys started going west. And so by the early 1800s, you got a bunch of them out and as far west as you could go back then. And the early 1800s, that was the Indiana Territory. Now, let me just draw your attention to the fact that they were known as Hoosiers in that territory. And the guy who led them to Christ was named Harry Hoosier. How did they get the name Hoosiers? Because when they got there, the other mountain men look at them and say, these guys are really different. They don't act the way the rest of us do. What's up with them? And the answer was, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. It was a derogatory term. Oh, they follow that Harry Hoosier. Hoosier, that's Indiana, the Hoosier state. I wonder how many people who live in Indiana know that they're named after a black evangelist. Probably nobody. I mean, but you would think that if a state's named after a guy, you might even have that in a history book somewhere. Not today. See, we don't even know, and I can't tell you how many, I've only met 2 people from Indiana who knew that they were named after a black evangelist, Harry Hoosier. Most people say, I had no idea where the name Hoosier came from. I'm in the Hoosier state, don't know. We don't even cover that anymore. So Harry Hoosier, significant guy that he was, that's the kind of people John Adams talked about. And he also talked about, and by the way, why would John Adams point to preachers and say, these are the guys responsible for America? It's because historians have documented that if you look at the Declaration of Independence, every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. Now, here's an interesting exercise for you. Take the Declaration of Independence and read it and look at it as a list of sermon topics, because that's what it was. All of those clauses had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. So what happened is we were just putting back on paper what we've been taught for the last 10, 15 years, and it was what the Bible says about these kind of issues. So that's why John Adams says our pulpits of thunder. That was his phrase that he used. Now, talking about our pulpits of thunder, let me just take you back for a minute. As Chad mentioned, we own about 120,000 documents from before 1812, thousands from thereafter. Let me take you back to some of the early sermons that were preached in the First and Second Great Awakening. We would call these revival sermons. A lot of people in America are praying for Revival Day, good thing to pray for. Look at the type of sermons that came out of the First and Second Great Awakening revivals. You have, for example, this sermon here. It was preached in 1755 as a sermon on earthquakes. Now, this is preached by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of those guys that John Adams specifically said he's responsible. I will tell you that I've served in a lot of churches, had a lot of staff positions. I read the Bible regularly. I think everybody should read the Bible through from cover to cover once a year. I've done that. I got a lot of white hair. I've done it a lot of times. And I thought, if I had to give a sermon on earthquakes, I think I could do a pretty good job. You got the earthquake with Uzziah. You got the earthquake when Jesus was crucified. You got the earthquake, the resurrection. I go through and name several earthquakes. I could probably stand up here and give you a good 20-minute sermon on earthquakes. Good for me. That was a 5-week sermon on earthquakes. I can't come anywhere close to that. But then I've never studied the Bible to see what it says about earthquakes. If I did, and you go to a concordance, you go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize. See, we don't notice a lot of things in the Bible. They did. Anything that came up in the news, they went to the Bible to say, what does the Bible say about this? That's why 5 years later, in 1760, Reverend Dr. Cooper, and that's another guy that Adams pointed to, did this sermon on the Great Fire in Boston. Whatever was in the news, people are thinking about it. Let's put a biblical perspective on what's in the news. So we dealt with natural disasters. We also had sermons like this one. This is a sermon on the sin of the cry of Sodom inquired into. It was a sermon on homosexuality, or if you want to say LGBTQ sermons. That's a topic that a lot of Christians are uncomfortable discussing today. It's not a topic the Bible's uncomfortable discussing. The Bible has a lot of stuff to say about sexuality and gender and other stuff. We may be silent on it. God's not silent on it. So that's why we had sermons like that. And by the way, I'm not saying sermons that point to pastors. Every single Christian should be able to put Bible verses to these topics. If we go through the Word of God, this is not hanging Pastor Billy out to dry because he's already involved and already engaged. This is saying we as Christians should be thinking about this with all topics that are out there. Here's a sermon on the discovery of a new planet. This was the Second Great Awakening sermon, 1847, Uranus. Here's a sermon that deals also with science. It's comets, the nature of blazing stars. At the bottom, 2 sermons occasioned by the late blazing star. Can you come up with a Bible verse that deals with comets? There's actually several Bible verses. I just hadn't paid attention to them until I read that sermon. I hadn't really noticed them before. Here's one on the reflections on a solar eclipse. This is 1806. This is the Second Great Awakening sermon. By the way, I couldn't think of a single verse on solar eclipse as I read the sermon, and he spent a lot of time in the little bitty book of Joel. The little book of Joel has a lot on eclipses, both solar and lunar eclipses, and I'd never noticed that as many times as I read Joel. So we covered issues of astronomy from the pulpit, also the infirmities and comforts of old age, and that's probably not a popular topic to cover, but it's certainly a needed topic, so we cover the issues of aging. We also covered this issue. This is a sermon on the importance of early and proper education of children. We talked about education. Now, we're not likely to do that today because we got so many teachers and so many parents. We might offend somebody if we were talking about how that education that's secular is not blessed by God. He says the fear of the Lord's the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord's the beginning of knowledge. And we have an entire national education system that won't let you have the fear of God in education, that won't teach the fear of God. But we can't say that because we'll offend people. So what? That's what the Word of God says. It ain't going to be good education if it doesn't have God in the center of it. And that's just the way it's going to be. The same when you look at religion and patriotism, the constituents of a good soldier. This is a 1755 sermon from the First Great Awakening. It's a sermon about the military. It was a deployment sermon, actually. But you remember, look at the Bible, even when John the Baptist was baptized, and he had specific instructions for officers and for soldiers. There's so much in the Bible in the military. Other sermons, this is the relation of the medical profession to the ministry. What does the Bible say about health care? And there are some really good health care laws in the Bible. There's a 1961 book called None of These Diseases, where that back in 1961, a physician went through the Bible and pulled out all the verses that dealt with health care. And he said, you know what? Here in 1961, which, that's a long time ago now, 60 years, he said, we now have medical medical studies that prove everything in the Bible was right. And that was 60 years ago. And that was revolutionary back then. So we had sermons on medicine. This is the present commercial distress, a sermon. This was on the crash of the economic system in 1837, what they called the Great Panic. Here's a sermon on the character and tendency of property tax. So we had sermons on economic issues, and the Bible has a lot to say about economics and taxes, what kind of taxes are good, what kind of taxes are bad. Here's a sermon preached in front of the Virginia General Assembly, the legislature. It's a sermon on the sinfulness and pernicious nature of gaming, so lotteries and gambling. Here's a sermon on the liquor law of Massachusetts. It's called a good law. We went through and looked at what the Bible says. And then you have this one on the injustice and policy of the slave trade. This is the first Great Awakening sermon. It is wrong to be engaged in the slave trade, and the Bible is very clear about that. And that's why nearly all of the abolition movement was led by active Christians. The abolition and anti-slavery and equality movement came out of the church, came out of like the Wesleyan Church and other churches. Well, yes, there were some Christians who took a pro-slavery position. Hard to do that biblically, but they did. But nonetheless, these are sermons on social issues. Here's one on marriage scripturally considered. 1837, New Hampshire passed a law on marriage, and the pulpit said, now the legislature just passed this law. Let's look at it and see what the Bible says. Okay, that law's okay because they did what the Bible said. I mean, we looked at everything through a biblical filter. Here's a sermon on the fugitive slave law. This may be the worst federal law ever passed in American history. And this law, I can't show you how many sermons we have on that where pastors saying, congregation, listen to me. You have to disobey this law. You have to commit civil disobedience because this law goes against what God's word says, and you can't obey it. Oh, wow, I don't know that I've heard any call for civil disobedience on any grounds today, even if it's biblical. But yet we had sermons back then. We were saying, have a backbone. Stand up for God, even if it goes against the culture. Get a backbone at some point. So social policy we covered. This is an election sermon. Yes, we covered voting and election back then. The church was very active in politics. So John Adams says the pulpits of thunder. Now, when I look at issues that are in the news today, every one of these issues, and by the way, these are the sermons back then, but every one of these issues that are popping up right now, they are issues that have been in the news in the last 18 to 24 months. And I chose them because they are issues that are in the news. So if you take, I don't know, minimum wage or estate tax, or you take rights of conscience or whatever, they've been in the news, and I chose those topics because the Bible addresses every single one of them. Most Christians today cannot put a Bible verse beside a progressive income tax, but the Bible talks about it, or what we call a capital gains tax, or the estate tax, or minimum wage. Didn't know the Bible talked about that. See, this is the relevancy of the Scripture if we apply it. They believed in relevancy back then. Today, we do a lot of polling work. I work a lot with George Barton, a great pollster, great brother, great friend. He's really concerned about biblical worldview. And most Christians today cannot give any Bible verses for any of these positions. As a matter of fact, when it comes to relevancy, only 2.8% of pastors in America today address from the pulpit what is in the news. So we don't get much application of the Bible to what's going on. And the problem with that is that affects our thinking. So we now compartmentalize. Here's what goes on in government, and here's what goes on in church. No, as Christians, we're involved, as Billy said, can't be a two-thirds Christian. You can't be just involved in family and a church. You got to be involved in government too, because God made all three institutions. And He made all three of them to run according to His standards. And we can't say, well, I don't want to be in that one, so it's all secular. That's not accurate. So what we've got to do is get that number changed. But you see, this is also why we're seeing a decline in the church today. When you look at numbers that have happened over the last 40 or so years, just in the last 20 years, the number of Christians in America has dropped 20% in the last 20 years. We've gone from 85% of the nation professing Christianity in 2000 to only 65% professing Christianity today. And when we poll and say, why did you leave the church? 2 out of 3 people say they leave the church because it lacks relevancy. They don't find anything that that gives them an answer for what they're seeing in the culture. That's where we as Christians have to step in with our neighbors and with those around us and say, hey, see what's in the headlines here? Do you know God says, no, I didn't know that. And we just need to show them how the Scripture is relevant, and people will come back to the Lord because they want answers. We're just not giving them very good answers. So all of that to say, we're in a position where we need a revival. This last part I'm going to do is kind of, what are the solutions? Because we've gotten ourselves in a real fix here. What do we do? So right now we're praying for revival. We need a revival. 3 years ago, there were 50,000 groups that met in civic locations around the United States praying for revival. I've been in stadiums where there's 100,000 people spent the whole day praying and fasting for revival in recent years. Even political leaders were there. So we really feel that we need a revival, but we have a problem right now. Even though we know we need that, one of the major obstacles we have to face, one of the hurdles we have to get over, is the fact that we have a national focus. We're obsessed with what goes on in the nation, and that's because of where we get our news. If you're on the right, maybe you get your news from Fox or from Victory News, or maybe you get it from Newsmax, or you get it from somewhere. If you're on the left, maybe you get it from CNN, or you get it from MSNBC. Whatever it is, what you watch is national news. You haven't heard a story about Waterton, New York, or about Scottsbluff, Nebraska, or about Jacksboro, Texas, or about Yukon, Oklahoma. So we see so much on the national level, that's where we think. And so what happens is, now, this national level kind of stuff that we have, I'm very engaged at the national level. I mean, what we're doing with Afghanistan last night, in the last 24 hours, I've talked to several dozen congressmen trying to get their help, and senators getting their help for what's going on in Afghanistan. So we've got to get other countries to put pressure on the Taliban. I mean, the stuff that we're doing is just, I don't have time to tell you. No, I do have time. Let me say it differently. I have time to tell you about it, but I can't because it's still very secret right now. Hopefully, we'll get some solutions over the next couple of days, get those planes off the ground. Our list has several thousand people that still have to be extracted from Afghanistan, including tons of Americans that are still stuck there. We have to get something going and get those people out of there. So things are really delicate right now. But having said that, even with all the contacts I have in political levels, and I've been involved in 13 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court, and I've got all this national experience, I'm still frustrated with what goes on. And so you look at it, and man, Congress, H.R. 1, are you kidding me? You want to nationalize everything? And H.R. 5, you want to take away my rights as a Christian? That's a federal piece of legislation. I'm frustrated that they would even consider that it got passed in the House frustrates me. And then I look at what happens at the court. The court has so undercut our culture and our values over the last 30 years. What they've done has not been good. I'm frustrated. And I know justice is the Supreme Court. And then I look at what happens at the White House. I'm going, guys, Afghanistan, it didn't have to go down this way. You made some really bad decisions. And so I'm frustrated, and I can't change a single one of those. Not a single one. Nor can most Americans. And so as a result, we get frustrated and we get paralyzed because we can't do nothing about it. So what happens is our focus is on the national level rather than on the local level, and we're frustrated because none of us can fix a problem at the national level. So let me take you back to the American War for Independence and give you an example of how things worked back then. Let me take you in the American War for Independence to the first 4 battles that occurred. If you look at the top right, that's the Battle of Lexington, 1775, April 19th, and about 3 hours later, the Battle of North Bridge and Concord, top left. Bottom left is the Battle of the Road to Boston. It was a running battle for 19 miles. It was about 2 hours after the Concord Bridge. And then over on the bottom right is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, all of those battles, nobody in any of those battles contacted George and said, hey, George, you're the national commander-in-chief. We got to have your help. Come help us. Nobody reached out to George. They all said, it's our community. We'll take care of it. Everything was local to them. You see, George Washington, the national commander-in-chief, actually was only involved in very few national battles. Never every battle occurred in a local area. And so, yeah, Washington was there for the Battle of Yorktown, the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Monmouth, and that's all good because we needed national help then. But most of the battles in the Revolution were local battles, whether it's the 4 I just told you about, or whether it's Kings Mountain or Cowpens, or whether it's the Battle of Great Bridge in Virginia. It was local people saying, this is our community. You're not going to do this to our community. Let me just take you through it quickly. If you look up here on the top right, the Battle of Lexington occurred on that morning. It was the alarm went out about 3 o'clock that morning, and 700 British came to town, and they were met by 70 Americans. But they weren't just 70 Americans. They were the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. And the Reverend Jonas Clark said, no, you're not going to do this in our community. We'll defend our community. The church went out. Reverend Jonas Clark's church, his 70 guys went out and took on the British. And by the way, black and white both attended his church. And wounded that morning were 18 Americans, including white patriots like John Robbins and black patriots like Princess DeBrook. They all went to church together. They were all patriots together. After the battle at Lexington, about 3 hours later, you hit the North Bridge at Concord. Now, North Bridge at Concord, at this point in time, Reverend William Emerson brings 300 guys from his church out there to stop the British, and they did. And the British said, you know, this isn't going the right direction because we had 70, now we got 300, there's only 700 of us. We better get ourselves back to Boston before we get in real trouble. So they turned into that forced march, 19 miles back to Boston or back to Charleston. Except all along the way, those 700 British faced 4,500 Americans along the way. They were getting shot at from both sides of the road. Where'd they come from? Well, Reverend Payson Phillips grabbed his church, said, guys, let's go defend our community. Reverend Benjamin Balch grabbed his church. It was Christians going out to defend their community. Said, you're not going to do this in our community. You're just not going to do it. So it was local communities defending. When you had the Battle of Bunker Hill, that was on June of 1775, you had Reverend Joseph Willard, who grabbed companies out of his church and went across town to fight the British. So much of what happened was on the local community. So much of what occurred in that period of time, we won the American Revolution because we won so many local battles. It's not that we had a series of national battles. We kept winning all the local battles because local people were committed to taking their local communities. Said, don't know what happens down in Virginia. I know what happens here in Massachusetts, and it ain't going to happen here. And so it was the communities fighting for their own communities, and so many did that all across the colonies that that's why we won the American Revolution. It was local action. So when you take that and look at it, that local focus, it's exactly the same for revival. If we want a revival, it's not going to be a national revival, it's going to be a local revival. Now we say, no, wait a minute, you got people like George Whitfield. Yes, you do. In the First Great Awakening, you have George Whitfield. He is a remarkable individual. George Whitfield preached for 34 years, had 18,000 sermons that he preached, and amazingly, 80% of Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Are you kidding me? That would be like 260 million Americans a day hearing you say something, except they didn't have mass communication back then. They didn't have. So how did 80% of Americans hear him preach a sermon? Because he was in 80% of the communities. He would go to this community of 300 and have a revival. He'd go to this community of 5,000 and have a revival. Go to this community of 460 have a revival. He had so many local revivals that it looked like a national revival when it was all done. It was not a matter of having a national revival. It was a matter of having a bunch of local revivals that became a national revival. And so even as we look at history, we often think of things nationally. No, you got to boil it down to what goes on locally. So you had people like Samuel Cooper. I mean, he was the guy in Boston. This is who John Adams talked about. And you have people like Gilbert Tennant around Philadelphia. He was the guy. He's the guy who kept the revival going in Philadelphia. And then you have Samuel Davies in the rural areas of Virginia. See, we don't talk about these guys, but the revival were local. They were all local, and that's what made a national revival. So we're praying for revival, take care of our own local area. So what happens, this obsession of national focus, we have to get past. We have to get to a local focus. And with that, let me take you for a minute to what happens on voting. You're probably tired of hearing this, especially you guys in Georgia. You've been pounded for the last year with everything possible about voting. Put it all aside for a minute. Let's just talk numbers. I just want to talk pure numbers. In the United States of America, all you have to do to vote is be 18 years or older and registered, and that's it. So 100% of the people who are 18 and legal can vote if they're registered, but only 67.1% are registered to vote. So I'm giving you national numbers. It's not local numbers. I don't know what they are locally. I'm just telling you, here's what the nation looks like. So right now, right off the bat, we've got about 100 million Americans say, we don't care what happens in the political arena. We ain't going to be part of it. We're not going to do anything with it. 100 million Americans. And a lot of those are traditional value Americans, but they don't do anything. They're not going to even register to vote. So let's take that next to the two types of elections we have. Last year, we went through what we call a presidential election every 4 years. What happened was, since the time of Ronald Reagan through last year, the average percentage of voters who turn out to vote in a presidential election is 54% of the nation. Now, that's not 54% of adults, that's 54% of registered voters. So it's not 54% of 100%, it's 54% of 67%, which means that only 36% of Americans vote in a presidential election, and it takes half of that to win, so 18% of Americans choose the President of the United States. Now, when you go to off-year elections, which is what's coming up this next election, is when we choose our governors and senators and reps and whatever, on average, 39% of registered voters vote, but that's 39% of 67%, which means only 26% of adults vote, which means the winner can win with 13%. So if you look at those two numbers, what this means is since the last about 41 years, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States, and 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our representative senators. That's not a very big crowd. We think of voting as being a really big obstacle. It's not, and especially if you break it down to the local area. When you look locally at what's happening, in an average local election, you have about 6% that turn out. But that's 6% of 67%, which means only about 4% of the community turns out in most local elections. It takes half of that to win, and that's 2%. Let me give you some examples of how this works. Let's take something like Los Angeles. Los Angeles is one of the largest cities in the nation. As a matter of fact, the city of Los Angeles is larger than 23 individual states in the United States. Eric Garcetti is the mayor of Los Angeles. So that's like being the governor of 23 states. Eric Garcetti brags that he won the election for mayor in LA with 2.9% of the vote. You're a governor with 2.9%. He has massive powers. Oh, churches aren't essential. We got to shut them down. 2.9% is what he was elected with. Let me take you to my state in Texas. Go to Houston for a minute. In Houston, what we had in Houston was, and by the way, Houston's one of the largest cities as well. It's the size of 20 different states. So being a mayor of Houston is like being governor of 20 states. But we elected a lady named Denise Parker. She was open lesbian, and she didn't like people who thought that marriage should be between a man and a woman. Now, she got elected, by the way, with 4.9% of the vote. But once she's in office, she says, you know what? We've got to stop these people who talk about marriage being a man and a woman. And so she enacted what was called HERO. That's the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. The Houston Equal Rights Ordinance said, if you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, that is a hate crime, and we will come after you. Now, by the way, the city of San Antonio did the same thing. They said that if and I was guilty. They said if I said that marriage was between a man and a woman, that's a Class C misdemeanor. I get fined $500 a day. I can never hold office in San Antonio. I can never run for office, and I can never do business with the city of San Antonio if I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. So these are called equal rights ordinances. A lot of cities passed them. And so when that happened in Houston, she went to 6 pastors she heard about that said marriage between a man and a woman, and she subpoenaed all of their sermons. She said, you got 16 foreign communication. I want to see all of them. I want to see your sermons and your sermon notes. I want to see anything you have on computer related to marriage. I want to see anything you have in your text, your transmissions, any of your social media. She subpoenaed 16 different forms of communications to see what they had said about marriage as a man and a woman. Now, at that point, we said, this is not a good deal. So we put together a referendum for the city of Houston to vote on that. We got 4,500 churches involved in that massive city of Houston. And the day of the election, the polling by the Houston newspaper showed that we were going to lose by a 60-40 margin. We're going to get crushed, and that ordinance is going to stand, except those 4,500 churches didn't turn out 4.9% of the vote. They turned out 14% of the vote in the special election. We ended up crushing the ordinance by a 61-39 margin. It was a 22-point win simply because churches showed up. Even a big city like Houston, just because the churches showed up, it turned Houston completely around in a different direction. They no longer have that hostile ordinance toward Christians. Let me take you to some other places a little bit different. Fort Worth, this is right near where I am. My ranch is just out west of Fort Worth. And Fort Worth, the Fort Worth Independent School District, 6 years ago now, is the first school district in the nation to say, don't think we need to do genders anymore. Let's have just common bathrooms. You can pick which bathroom you want to go to. You can not only pick your bathrooms, you can pick your locker rooms. Just take any locker room you want. And of course, there's no way that a high school boy is going to say that he can get into a girl's locker room. That would never happen. Nobody would ever do. I mean, what a stupid idea. Have you seen what California did recently? They're all women's prison. Because you can choose your identity in California, they're all women's prison now is having pregnancies like crazy, and they can't figure out why. It's because 300 males said, hey, I'm a woman, moved over in the all women's prison. Guess what's going on in the all women's prison? They're having a lot of pregnancies, and they can't figure out why, because they don't think there's a gender difference. They can't see a difference in gender. We're really stupid at times, if I can just be real blunt about this. So here they are in Fort Worth, and see what really ticks me off. And by the way, Arnie Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education at the time under Obama, picked up and said, this is a great idea. Let's do this all over the nation. So he said, if any public school gets federal funds, you can't have gender bathrooms. You have to have kids choose whatever gender they want to be, go to whatever bathroom they want to. And what really ticked me off is this came out of basically my hometown, Cowtown, USA. All right, I'm a cowboy from Texas. This is not the way cowboys think. We know there's only two genders. Anybody who's ever been on a ranch or a farm knows there's only two genders. I mean, it's simple stuff. It's the laws of nature. So it came out, and I was really ticked at it, and I started looking. There in the city of Fort Worth, there's 800,000 voters in Fort Worth. And the guy that was president of the school board that made this crazy decision got elected with less than 1,200 total votes in that city. Matter of fact, I think it was 1,182. So I started looking around in the district where he ran, and I found a single church that had more than 3,000 evangelical adults in that church. One single church could have kept that guy from being on the school board, could have stopped that policy, which went all over the nation. It came out of Fort Worth because we didn't keep that guy from being elected. And this 1,182 votes. It's not a hard thing to do in a city that size. So again, that's the local focus, that's the emphasis. A couple other things to point to real quick. I've been talking big towns. Let me go to Bentonville, Arkansas. This is the hometown of Walmart. 40,000 people in Bentonville, Arkansas. A Christian lady there said, no, you're not going to do this in my school. She ran for school board, and in a town of 40,000, she got elected with a total of 35 votes. 35 people out of 40,000 voted for school board. She got elected. And let me take you to Riceville, Iowa. Go from Bentonville to Riceville, Iowa. And Riceville, Iowa was a pig farmer. And he said, not in my school, you don't. I'm running for school board. He ran for school board. And it turned out he was busy on the farm that day, and he ended up not voting for himself. Now, don't think he lost by one vote, because that wasn't the deal. What happened was nobody voted at all in that election. Not a single vote. If he had voted for himself, he would be on the school board, because nobody even voted. See, this is where we got to focus on local stuff. That's where things get started. From Fort Worth, it went to the whole nation. That's why local stuff is so important. So final example I'll give you, South Lake is outside of Fort Worth. This year, critical race theory came into South Lake last 2 years, and it's been interesting because in South Lake, black and white students are both equal in academics, one of the few places in the nation where there is no racial tension, and blacks and whites have academic outcomes the same, and it's a really good place. And they started teaching how bad America was and how bad racist it was, and people said, what are you doing? We've got great things going here in the city. We've worked really hard to get this. And so what happened was 51 churches got together, and they found that there was an open mayor position. There was not open, but the mayor was up for re-election, 2 city council were up for re-election, and 2 school board were up for re-election. The churches got together and said, let's find some good people to run. They got the 5 people recruited, and on election, the Sunday before election, all 51 churches put up a slide on their projector, said, hey, don't vote for it, not telling you who to vote for, but here's 5 really. The turnout was 3 times higher than it's ever been in their history, and it was a 70-30 margin for all 5 that got elected. So all 5 have gone in. They have turned the city around completely since that election, because they have the mayor and 2 city councilmen, 2 school board members. All the nonsense has stopped. It's now come back to a place of sanity. And that was just in one election because 51 churches got involved. So local focus is a really big deal. I'll wrap this down with a couple of historical thoughts. Dr. Benjamin Rush, I mentioned him earlier, he talked about Harry Hoosier. Benjamin Rush is called the father of public schools under the Constitution. That's because in 1790 and 1791, he wrote these pieces, The Mode of Education, Proper and Republic. 1791, he wrote a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of public schools in America. He started 5 universities, still go today. He started academic education for women. He started all sorts of medical education for black folks. So he's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. It's interesting. He said the purpose of public schools is, number 1, to teach students to love and serve God. Interesting. He said the purpose of public schools, number 2, is to teach students to love and serve their country. And number 3, to love and serve their family. Now, please notice the order. God, country, family. I think he got that wrong. I think it should be God, family, and country, because family is so important. No, he said God, country, and family for the simple reason he said if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy of your family. Once you lose your country, you'll have bad policies that will affect your family. And see, that's what we're seeing with school boards now. You see all the nonsense that's coming out of schools in the last 3, 4, 5, 7 years. This is what's an attack on the family in a way we've never seen. We haven't been involved in that side of politics, and now we're paying a price for it with our kids and how far they're moving the other direction. So school boards, that's why it's a focus. That's why we have thousands running this year. God's just putting it on people's hearts. You got to get control of this system. And it goes back to that God, country, and then family. If you lose control of your country, it becomes the enemy of the family. So how do we get good candidates? This is where I think churches have an opportunity and Christians have an opportunity to revolutionize the nation. I want to read you a parable that came out of the book of Judges. It's called the parable of the trees of the field. In that parable, the trees of the field, it says that one day the trees went forth to anoint a king over them. And so they went first to the olive tree and said, "Reign thou over us." But the olive tree said to them, "No, should I leave my fatness, wherewith by they honor both God and man, to go and be promoted over the trees? I'm not going to be your leader. I don't want to be your ruler." So they went next to the fig tree and said to the fig tree, "Come down and reign over us." But the fig tree said unto them, "No, I don't think I will. Should I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go be promoted over the trees? I'm not going to run for office." So they then went to the vine and said to the vine, "Come down and reign over us." And the vine said to them, "No, I'm not going to do that. Should I leave my wine, which shares both God and man, to go be promoted over the tree?" So they keep going all these good trees and say, "Please be our leader." And none of the good trees would say yes. They all said, "I'm not going to do that. I'm busy with other stuff." And so after all of them said no, interesting what the trees did. It said the trees, then said the trees unto the bramble. Now, you can already tell this ain't going to turn out real good. Then said the trees unto the bramble, "Come thou and reign over us." And wouldn't you know, that's the one that said yes. Happy to reign over you. And it says, as a matter of fact, if you anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. How much fun is it to live in the shadow of brambles? Not much fun. See, the problem we have today is we have too many brambles that are now ruling in so many areas. We got brambles ruling all, because the good people won't step up. The fig tree and the vine and the olive tree, "Nah, I got too much to do." Well, the brambles have lots of time for this kind of stuff. And that's what the problem is. So how do you avoid brambles as rulers? Bible's good on that too. See, Exodus 18:21, the scripture says in Exodus 18:21, it says, to provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. Here's your local, county, state, and federal, and you need to choose, you need to provide, right here, you need to provide people who fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, able men. So look right here, find those kind of people and make them rulers over 10, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Now, how do you do that? How do you provide out of all the people? It's interesting to me that the way that this happened was in Moses. And Moses told this not only in Exodus 18:21, but in Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 15. Moses said, "I went and chose a bunch of candidates for you and brought them to you and said, you choose who you want." And so in Exodus, in Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 15, the people chose from among those that Moses presented them. So it's interesting that the spiritual leaders went and recruited the civil leaders. Moses went and recruited the civil leaders. You have the same thing when you look at King Saul. Who anointed Saul? Wasn't the people? It's the spiritual leader Samuel. Samuel said, "Hey, God wants you to be the guy." And then after Saul, you had David. Who anointed David? Spiritual leader said, "Hey, David, God wants you to be the guy." And then after David, it was Solomon. Who anointed Solomon? Nathan and Gad. See, it was always the spiritual leaders choosing out the civil leaders, and that's where you had good civil leaders, was when we got involved in that arena. So that's an arena we need to get back into. And I'll just tell you real frankly, I've spent a lot of time recruiting candidates on that Bible verse right there. Because getting good people to run for office, they don't like to do it. They don't like being called names. They don't like being shouted at. They don't like having to get in fights and arguments. But if they don't, we get inundated with what we're seeing right now. So how do you get good people involved? And it was a hard thing. But what I have found over time is that I want to elect people that I don't have to lobby. And a lot of the people I got to run for office, I have never in my life called them and told them to vote pro-life. I've never called them once and said, "Make sure that you remember marriage is between a man and a woman." I've never. That's why I got them in there, was because they already believed that. I don't want to lobby them. I want people with the right worldview. But you see, to elect people with the right worldview, you have to recruit people with the right worldview. And that's where it starts, and that's where we can get on the front side of this as Christians, is get on the front side, and you guys are already doing it. I mean, what Billy was telling us with what's happened in Newton County and the change of political leadership, and that's the way you do that kind of stuff. And so taking a community, that's how it happens. That's what will lead to a national change. So all of this, I'll close with this. Charles Finney great revivalist. He was part of the Second Great Awakening. As a matter of fact, we're told that in 1 year alone, he led 100,000 people to Christ. But Charles Finney believed that revival was a science, that you could generate revivals. And that's why he wrote a book in 1835, a series on revival, lectures on revivals. And it's like 2 Chronicles 7:14. God says, if my people will do this, then I will hear from heaven and answer. So that's what he said. He says, if we'll do certain things, God will do certain things. He's waiting for us to do some things. And so that's why he said you can generate a revival by choosing to do things that are in the Scriptures. And so this is what Charles Finney taught ministers in his day. He was the greatest influencer of the church and of ministers in that day. He said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said, politics are part of a religion in a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. Ooh, I would just as soon blame it on the bad guys. No, God's going to blame it on the good guys because we didn't take the ground. We had the opportunity to do so, and we didn't. And by the way, may I point out that this quote I just gave you came out of a revival lecture number 15, which he called Hindrances to Revival. If you want a hindrance to revival, then stay out of politics. Wait a minute, I thought that's how you got a revival. No, because again, the political climate is what sets the tone and the atmosphere for both the family and the church. I mean, just look at Afghanistan. That's a pretty good indication. You lose your government. Bible study last night, we just got word that the Taliban broke in on a Bible study last night and murdered every single person in that room because they were at the Bible study. You get a bad government, you're going to have a bad time at church and a bad time with family. And so that's what we understood, and that's what the Bible's clear about. So all of that to say, need to get involved. It's really important. What you guys have done here at the church is a great example, but don't stop there. You just keep moving. Remember, you can't be 2/3 of a Christian. I like what Pastor Billy said. You can't be just a Christian involved in family and in church. You got to be family, church, and the civil arena. God made all three areas. If this is new to you, you want more information, you can get it out of the book we've got on the back called The American Story, or also from the Founder's Bible. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.
How many of y'all believe every American ought to hear that? How many of y'all believe every American ought to hear that? How many of y'all heard something you've never heard before? Thank you, brothers. How many of y'all heard something you've never heard before? We believe this guy's a national treasure. We believe this information, if it were to get out there, it would change our country. It would restore us a nation. It would put us right back where we ought to be, in God's hand instead of in these people's hands that literally hate you, hate what you stand for because they hate him. If you haven't gotten this, he's got some phenomenal information. The American Story, this is what I'm into. I'm reading it for the second time. This is as good a compilation of history of America from soup to nuts, from the beginning to now. This has all sorts of information about American history. You ought to teach it to your kids. You ought to teach it to your grandkids. You ought to read this yourself. But you ought to really be checking what your kids are studying. If they're in public schools, if your grandkids are in public schools, you ought to check it by this. The Founder's Bible, you want to hear what the founders had to say and their quotes as they were studying the Bible, and how the Bible became an instrument in their way they wrote the Constitution, the Declaration, the founding documents. David Barton is an American treasure. I'm so honored that he and Cheryl would take their time. I think they'll go back in the back and sign some books for y'all if y'all want to meet them and get to know them a little bit. But here's what I want you to do. If you know you got to get involved somehow, hit that QR code. I think it's in your seats. I think we're handing them out. I think it's up on the screen. You can scan it. If you want to get involved, we will get you information. We don't want anything from anybody. We want to get you engaged in your state. If you're from a different state, there'll be links for that QR code for the state you're in for voter registration. We need people to make sure Christians are not just registered to vote next year, but are voting in every single election, down to the school board, the city council, county council. Y'all know what's going on with elections. Anybody concerned about the election situation? We're teaching people how to get involved with election integrity by being poll watchers. In Virginia right now, churches that Pastor Billy and I are involved with, I think we have 212 churches who are recruiting people to be poll watchers for this fall's elections. In that state, you got to be a sworn election official. If you hit the QR code and you're from Virginia, we'll link you to a form to exactly how you get that done. We want to be an instrument to make sure the church does find its voice and we are heard, because we don't want just Christian votes. We want Christian voices throughout America to restore us a nation. We are so honored to be here. Pastor Billy, I know you want to come up and close in prayer. I want y'all to make sure you meet David and Cheryl Barton. I want to make sure you get that information in the hands of your kids and grandkids. And God bless y'all. Thank y'all so much for honors with having us here tonight. Thank you.